Welcome to Film Witch Podcast with me, Sandy Settle, practicing pagan witch and tarot reader for over a decade and a big fan of films. Here I talk about movies, their intersections with witchcraft and femininity, and whatever else I have on my mind, which is usually a lot. Blessed be. Come in and sit for a spell. And please rate and review me on Apple, follow me on YouTube and Spotify, and share this podcast with someone you think might enjoy it. It helps way more than you might realize, and it means everything to me. Please consider joining my Patreon, which is the best thing you can do to help this podcast continue. You can also find me on Instagram and on Letterboxd at FilmWitchPod. You can send kind words, suggestions, and business inquiries to filmwitchpod@gmail.com. From 2020, Gretel, her little brother Hansel, and their mother are destitute after the death of their family patriarch. When Gretel turns down a chance to work for a wealthy landowner, for her own safety, that is, their mother throws them out. After wandering in the woods for many days, they find the curious triangular house of an old woman who turns out to be a witch. At first she seems to want nothing from them, freely bestowing food and beds. But as time goes on, her real intentions become more and more mysterious, as does Gretel's own emerging supernatural power. For his third film, Oz Perkins continues his exploration of the mysteries of femininity and the occult, and the unavoidable pain of being human. Hello, everybody. It's me again. First of all, I want to thank you for being here, and I want to also apologize for how long it took me to get this episode out. I know last month I had no episode. Life gets really busy sometimes, just even during good times, life is very busy. And my husband and I have a small toddler. She's certainly a handful and takes up a lot of time. She's still really little. And some days you just run out of time. I'm sure everybody who is listening who is a parent knows what I'm talking about. But on top of that, my husband had some medical issues that I needed to help him with last month. My mother came to visit us, and the world is a shitstorm right now. And I know everybody listening to me knows that and is well aware of that. I think it's important in times like these to be honest about where you are and how you're feeling. I think trying to pretend like everything's okay is not particularly helpful. I think it's good to be hopeful, right? It's very vital, I think, to our survival in many ways to continue to be hopeful about our individual fates and the fate of humanity at large, right, at times like these. But at the same time, I think it's also very vital to be transparent about how you're feeling and how you're doing and your mental health and things like that. Hiding that stuff, I think we can see from the generations that preceded us, can be very toxic and can also perpetuate generational trauma and all kinds of things that are bad and no. So I want to be clear that the past few weeks since the beginning of the year particularly have been difficult for me, emotionally, psychologically, emotionally. I'm a very emotional person by nature. If you know me in person, you know that I cry at the drop of a hat. I'm just, one of those people. I'm always kind of on the verge of tears, a lot of the time. So, things like this, I think, if I'm not careful, they can be debilitating, right? And I know that that's like probably the worst thing any of us could do is to let ourselves become debilitated by the trauma of this moment, right? So I've been doing what I can to mitigate that kind of compulsion in myself to just hide under a blanket and hope that it all goes away soon. When I was a kid, when there were thunderstorms, I would literally force myself to take a nap. Like I would go under a blanket and be like, sleep, 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 because I was scared. And there's this little part of me that is still like that sometimes, in the face of something that's truly terrifying. I don't mean like day-to-day difficulties. I'm actually quite recklessly brave when it comes to the difficulties of the day-to-day. I think I kind of, stubbornly plow through things. most of the time. I am a Leo rising after all, but my moon is in Pisces, and there's this part of me that wants to sleep until it's all over. When things start to really go south, like this scenario we all find ourselves in here at the beginning of 2025. So yeah, I know it's been a minute since anybody heard from me on the podcast. I acknowledge that, but here I am. I'm back, and I'm gonna do my best throughout the rest of the year to continue to at least get the main channel episode and the Patreon episode up every month. Can't promise more than that at this point. Several things would have to go really well for me to commit to more than that over the course of the month at this point anyway. But yeah, I do want to try to stick to that in particular after the initial shock of January. All that being said, I wanted to do the 2 episodes for at least this first half of February. We'll see if I'm going to try to maybe make up episodes later in the month for missing January. We'll see if that actually happens or not. I can't make any promises right now. If not, we'll just, do those episodes that I plan to do this month to make up for the March episodes. But for this month, I decided that I wanted to do to cover some of the films of Oz Perkins because this month his film called The Monkey is coming out in theaters. I believe it's already out as of right now when I'm recording. I think it just came out a day or 2 ago. I just started seeing people reviewing it on Letterboxd within the past couple of days, so it must have just dropped. I'm a little off schedule as far as like keeping up with when movies are dropping in the theater these days because I can never go. Like I said, I have a little kid and I am her primary caretaker during the day. So yeah, my husband and I very rarely get to see films in theaters these days, much to our chagrin. I mean, we fell in love going to movies together, so we certainly miss it. My mom was visiting last month, like I said, and thank goodness Nosferatu was still in theaters when she was here, and he and I finally got to go see that in an actual theater. I'm so glad I didn't. I caught the tail end of the theater run there for that film because everybody who knows me knows that I'm a massive Robert Eggers fan. But I wish I could say that I was going to see The Monkey in theaters. Sadly, I will probably miss it in theaters. Hopefully, I will be able to see it as soon as it drops for streaming. I am a big fan of Oz Perkins films thus far. Not as don't get mad at me, but I did not love Longlegs the way that I wanted to and hoped to and expected to. This past year, 2024, was kind of for me personally, it was mostly a year of anticipating things and being excited for them and then being kind of disappointed by them. I think in many cases my anticipation was built up a little too high and became a little bit unrealistic, and those expectations could not hope to have been met. Certainly Longlegs falls into that category for me, and definitely The Substance as well. 2 films I expected to really love and did not. I did like Longlegs a little more than The Substance. I didn't care for The Substance. I know a lot of people really love that film. I'm happy for them. I'm happy for anybody who's enjoying it. I'm really happy for Demi Moore if she wins the Oscar. That's cool. That's just downright cool. Even if you don't care for that film like me, the fact that she's nominated and that she might win, and it's clearly, a horror film. It's a certain kind of horror film, which is, I think, the only kinds that the Academy really still rewards. But nevertheless, I gotta be happy when a horror film is nominated, especially one as gory as The Substance. So, but I think I'm gonna really like The Monkey. I read the short story by Stephen King last month or the month before. It's not very long. I think it's in Skeleton Crew, one of his books of short stories. He's a wonderful short story writer. If you have only read more of his novels, highly recommend seeking out his short stories and getting to know them. He's known for being very long-winded in his novels, and he's a surprisingly good short story writer, considering the fact that sometimes, he can be very prolific and kind of long-winded in some of his long-form stories. Some of his best work is his short stories. The Monkey, the short story, is certainly a bit dated, I would say. So go into it kind of with that understanding that it was written, in the 80s. So don't expect it to kind of meet the standards of today as far as some of the language in it and things like that. But it's a good short story, and there's a really great Red Band trailer for The Monkey that came out a few weeks ago that I just like. I really dug it. I thought it was a great trailer. A lot of trailers these days are not very good, so when there's a good one, I feel like it's kind of a cause for celebration. Like, oh, this is like a genuinely good, well cut trailer. I thought the Red Band trailer for The Monkey falls into that category, so I'm very much looking forward to it. I am not going to talk about Longlegs. Maybe I will at some point in the future. Like maybe if I do an episode about The Monkey, I'll do the Patreon episode about Longlegs and kind of get into reasons why I found it underwhelming and some of my criticisms of it. That movie is still a 3-star movie for me because there were some things about it I loved a lot. Micah Monroe, I love her. She's a great actress. I love her and pretty much everything I've seen her in was so great. And Cleo Kuno's Watcher, a really great film about just feminine trauma and feminine horror. She's great in that film too, in Longlegs. But yeah. I wanted to talk about some of his films that I really love. I actually love all 3 of his films prior to Longlegs. Love them a lot. So you can imagine how high my expectations were for Longlegs because I love his previous work so much. But I did want to talk today about Gretel and Hansel. This movie came out around 2020. Unfortunately, that was, as many of you know, when the pandemic started, the COVID-19 pandemic. So those of us who were there know that a lot of the films that came out that summer and spring didn't really have much of a theatrical run because nobody was able to go to theaters around that time. And it kind of took a little bit for some of the films from that period to gain a following or to be watched at all. So I think that of Oz Perkins' work, he's had like kind of bad luck prior to Longlegs with his film releases. The Black Coat's Daughter, which I talk about in the Patreon episode for this month, was delayed a bunch of times for some reason. It actually came out on wide release after I Am the Pretty Thing That Lives in the House, which is the film that dropped on Netflix. As everyone knows, Netflix is not a great place for your film to drop, especially these days, but back then it was also true as well that things just get buried if they are not conventional enough to be widely watched. If they're not Carry On, no shade on Jamie Colette Serra. I don't know how you say his name, the guy who directs those films. If it doesn't have a broad appeal like that, it's probably going to get buried in the algorithm. I feel like that definitely happened with I Am the Pretty Thing, a very strange, slow burn, atmospheric horror film that a lot of people don't really seem to get. And if you ask me, I'm like, what is there to get? This is a great slow burn, atmospheric haunted house, feminine horror story. I don't really, if it's not for you, it's not for you, but I don't think to claim you don't get things like that, I think is an interesting stance to take, because I just feel like it is a haunted house story, and if you can hang with it, I think things like that become a lot more clear as far as like their atmosphere, their narrative intentions, things like that. A lot of people these days definitely don't have the attention span for slow horror, but I Am the Pretty Thing is actually my favorite film of his, and I'll definitely talk about it at some point. Probably I'll pair it with another haunted house movie. That's a polarizing film of his, and it's my favorite film of his. So when it comes to Gretel and Hansel, this one is unique among his films, in my opinion. I think his first 2 films, between Black Coat's Daughter and I Am the Pretty Thing, they have some strong similarities. All of his films are different as far as the narrative goes, like the narrative concentration, I Am the Pretty Thing is a haunted house movie. Blackcoat's Daughter is kind of a satanic possession film that is secretly about grief and loss. Gretel and Hansel is stylistically built this in the same basic structure as a fairy tale story, as the original Grimm fairy tale story. There are some differences in this version, but structurally, they stick pretty close to that kind of fairy tale atmosphere. The only other film I feel like I could think of that reminded me of this one stylistically, and as far as like how they choose to convey this narrative and kind of like this stylistic, almost sometimes abstract, very unconventional method, with lacking some of this kind of like more hopeful romanticism that is present in more contemporary retellings of fairy tales, and happy to nestle in this kind of like dark fairy tale atmosphere. Robert Eggers mentions a lot, wanting to, being very interested in fairy tales and folklore, and his films certainly reflect that to some extent. I wouldn't say that at this point I feel Robert Eggers has made a fairy tale film, right? They're all like folklore adjacent films. But this film, Oz Perkins' Gretel and Hansel, I feel is a dark fairy tale film, right? And the other film I could think of that reminded me of it is David Lowery's The Green Knight. Not a fairy tale film so much, but fairy tale in its vibe, Would you call the King Arthur stories fairy tales? No. But mythological folklore, falling into that category. And I think that there are strong correlations between the way that Lowery chooses to frame his film version of Green Knight and the choices that Perkins makes with Gretel and Hansel. I just see a correlation between the two films as far as the way they choose to convey a fairy tale atmosphere. I had only watched this film once before rewatching it for this episode, and I remember really loving it the first time. The second time, more of the kind of like the running themes in Perkins' work became clear to me watching this film the second time around, as far as like where this fits into kind of the broader tapestry of his narrative preoccupations and his interests. At one point, one of the characters in the film towards the beginning says, "For it is only the bitter end that comes for everyone anyway." There's a strong theme of inevitable death or inevitable doom in Perkins' work. I think it's present in all of his films thus far, and certainly seems like it will be in The Monkey as well, since this monkey toy like literally causes people to die in gruesome ways. That's like the gist of The Monkey. I Am the Pretty Thing That Lives in the House. Certainly that is present in that film. I don't want to spoil anything, but definitely death is present in the film, strongly so. Blackcoat's Daughter also deals with kind of this inevitable feeling of demise, right? This encroaching doom, sense of doom is kind of all laden all over the atmosphere of that film. Love that film. And certainly for Gretel and Hansel as well. It's a little bit touched a little bit more lightly in this film. But that being said outright, I thought was very on par with his work. Interesting, since this is the only film of his that he did not write himself. I can understand why he was drawn to the script for this film, because it, kind of touches on a lot of the things that he's interested in as well. Another common theme in Perkins' films is, I wrote it as the plight of women in a hostile world. I read a really great interview with him that he did with Polygon. And in that interview, he was asked about his kind of like always choosing female protagonists for his films. I guess that's going to be true of every film up to The Monkey, have female protagonists. And he said, "For me, female protagonists add a welcome layer of mystique and mystery, things I can't easily grasp. Keeps me in a place of not knowing, which is the place where I like to create art." reminded me, of course, of my favorite filmmaker, my favorite contemporary filmmaker, Robert Eggers, again, who also seems to choose female protagonists most of the time. For this same reason, I think I'm sure he's been asked that in interviews too. I don't have a direct quote from him, but I would imagine if he has been asked that, he said something similar. This kind of like marriage between the female as an archetype and mystique and mystery, as Perkins puts it. I remember I did an early review of The Black Coat's Daughter, I think back in 2017, where I mentioned, kind of like noticing this preoccupation that he has on women and young women, particularly. The interview for Polygon also mentions this kind of like interest in young women specifically and their difficulty in navigating the world. And I'm glad that this interviewer from Polygon noticed that the way that I feel I have noticed it in his work. And I like his answer a lot. I feel like, this kind of like innate marriage of feminine archetype and occultism, I think, is kind of my sweet spot. Hence my favorite filmmakers all kind of being like preoccupied with that. I'm so typical. This interview with Polygon, they also ask him, like, are you approaching things personally, like being like kind of like consciously like trying to take a feminist perspective or a feminist angle? To that, he said, I try to approach my stories from a feminist standpoint to the degree that feminism is about equal handedness in treatment. I've always assumed that as the right position to be in. So to me, it sounds like, he's not like consciously inserting like feminist rhetoric or feminist ideals into the context of the film per se, but it's more like an understanding of women being trapped in a world where we are often not given equal-handed treatment with other people around us, or with men specifically, with masculine archetype versus feminine archetype, and masculine archetype being the ruling class in society, in this world since modern society began. So at least in the Western world, certainly. I can't speak as well on the Eastern traditions, but, I think it's true for a lot of them as well. I've always assumed that is the right position to be in. So to me, Perkins is kind of saying here that he is interested in approaching the world from that imbalance, right? That place of imbalance that inequality between the sexes creates in culture and in society, and the dissonance, from the feminine perspective. When you're living in a world that's inherently hostile to you in that way, right? How do you navigate such a world? How do you survive in such a world? And I can see, from what those previous comments, why he would kind of use that as a jumping off point, as a starting point. I think that's why a lot of women are drawn to horror at all, right? Is that we're already functioning in this world that is like horrific to us in many ways, right? The lack of autonomy that we are afforded, devastating that in 2025 we are where we are with a lot of that. I think many of us, as we've been coming of age, have hoped that would be, that we would be all turning over a new leaf societally. And I think that is what's happening in the broader scope, right? But in the short term, I think we're in for a really rough ride for a little while. And it's devastating, right? For those of us who have been consciously applying ourselves to this particular issue, men, women, and non-binary people alike, right, to this issue of gender inequality and sexism. I think, we're in a tough spot right now. And I think more than ever, us feminine people, we need horror films as that release, as that outlet, as that place where the dissonance is recognized. In the film, it's stated pretty early on outright that Gretel clearly has supernatural powers. She's seems to be similarly aligned with the aforementioned a beautiful girl in the pink hat, right? In the story that's told at the very beginning of the film, that she has second sight, as they call it in the film, which is kind of a premonitory understanding of things that she can't see, or things that haven't happened yet, things of that nature. I think this particular point in the film, is kind of like furthering Gretel's like otherness, right? That she is not only female, but also has this thing that would other her from other feminine people, right? And create a sense of lonesomeness, of solitary ness, of being outcast from the rest of society. This film in particular has now that I mention it, an interesting strain of individual destiny, kind of like a fatedness. Just a interesting rumination, I think, as far as what the film is kind of asking questions about, or interrogating, or exploring. I love the unique design of the witch's house in this film. The Polygon interview, he kind of talks about them not wanting to do something conventional, wanting to purposefully come up with a design that was unique and wasn't really something that you would think of when you think of, this particular fairy tale or a witch's house or anything like that. They didn't mention this specifically, but I did kind of feel like it was inevitably, inspired by the witch houses that you see for like those early New England style houses, like the witch house in Salem, Massachusetts. It's interesting because this house though is kind of like just a solid triangle with like a longhouse style attachment. Just really unique. I mean, in some ways it's similar to, what you would think of as like a witch's house. In other ways, the shape is extremely unconventional. The triangle motif used consistently in the film, I think, is just an interesting thing that you can kind of put your own meaning onto. As far as the interview with Perkins, he was asked about the triangles that are a recurring motif, and he said, "It's a primal, elemental, simple, undeniable force. It says to the audience, this movie is what it is itself in an immovable way. The triangle announces the film as concretely and recognizably different. It came to me as a way to focus the visuals around something distinct." So I guess he just used, more than anything, it sounds like Perkins, as the director, used it as a jumping off point for kind of like a design consistency, right? Speaking for myself and my own practice of witchcraft and my experience as a practitioner, the triangle is fire element. And so, when I saw it, it was kind of like the triangle being the symbol of elemental fire, that is also associated with enlightenment and spiritual transformation. The witch's house is kind of always like awash in this kind of like golden orange red color. Her house seems to be almost like burning from within. It certainly is visually arresting, but I think there's also, this running theme of transformation with Gretel specifically. So I thought that the triangle motif is very apt in that way, like if we're talking about like the spiritual and emotional transformation and enlightenment of the feminine psyche and the feminine experience, you can posit all kinds of things from that. I just think it's kind of like symbolically rich. And I'm glad that they don't, get very specific with it, because you can kind of put your own meaning on it. I really love Alice Krieg, who plays the witch in this film. She's in another movie that I watched a few months ago called She Will, which is also kind of a witchy film. I did not love that film the way that I wished to. I think I was thinking of her role in this film and how much I love it. She's playing very similar roles in each of those. But she's just one of those people who just like was born to play a witch at some point in her life. Just love a lot of the design choices in the film, things that are just really visually compelling and evoke a certain sense of unease, but also are beautiful. I think that kind of like sweet spot between those two emotions is kind of what I love the most in a lot of horror. I want an element of beauty interjected with like the horror element, right? Beauty with like the grotesque or something like that. I think that's kind of why I didn't like The Substance very much, because there just wasn't really a lot for me to hold on to with like an artistic sense of beauty, right? I'm not talking about like Margaret Qualley being young and beautiful. I'm talking about like beauty and design, right? Which I found to be incredibly lacking in that film. I want more of a sense of aestheticism, I guess. I do consider myself to be, like, for lack of a better way to say this, an aesthete, right? Like, I'm very interested in, like, what the visual element is invoking in me, right? And I think that horror is at its best when it's compelling, right? But also horrifying. I think the compelling element was missing for me in Substance. I know a lot of other people find it compelling, though, and I'm happy for them. But I think, I just kind of wanted to bring that up because if you're asking me what I find compelling visually in a film, right, I think I am a huge horror fan, right? I know I've only covered horror films thus far in the podcast, not because this is a horror podcast, but because I love horror films and I think that they have a strong connection with witchcraft and with practitioners and the pagan way and things like that. So, I just happen to keep landing on horror adjacent films because they speak to me and my personal, path so strongly in my personal work as a practitioner. It's like a film like this, you watch a film like Gretel and Hansel and you can tell that there's so much work that's been done to make this visually arresting, right? To make this visually compelling, and not always from a standpoint of the visually beautiful, but often marrying the beautiful and the grotesque in that way that you like don't, you're at a point of unease, but you also don't want to look away because what you're seeing is so compelling. Perkins hasn't talked as much about his personal interest in the occult as, for instance, Robert Eggers, at least not that I've been able to find direct quotes, but it's clear that he does have an interest in the occult, right? It seems as though, there's points in this particular script where there's a direct correlation made between feminine empowerment and witchcraft, right? Not the first film, certainly, to make this correlation, but I think that it's an important one when you're talking about why feminine people in particular seem to be highly drawn to the craft, right? It's a sense of empowerment where we have been disenfranchised and disempowered throughout the centuries. So, if you're looking for alternative ways to empowerment in a society that doesn't want you to have any power, right? Witchcraft is very essential in this way, right? Giving one a sense of personal power, personal choice, a hand in one's own destiny. That I think the film touches on in some really interesting, subtle ways, right? It's not overt, I think. I like that very much about it, that a lot is left ambiguous. Certainly that sense of mystery that Perkins brings up being tied to the feminine is something that I think is often present in the craft, right? This deep sense of mystery, of things being unknowable in the way that the tangibility of the plane of the living, the plane of reality is tangible, but the plane of the occult is not. I think rather than trying to define the occult as some modern practitioners do, I think, it speaks to me more personally, speaks more truthfully to me when a work is content to be unsure about such things. I think no matter how long you have been working in the craft or how long you've been a practitioner or, have been kind of awake to this specific aspect of your personhood and your path, right? I think at some point you accept that you're always a student, right? I'm a tarot reader, and in the tarot there are 4 cards that are page cards or princess cards in some decks. Are about forever learning, right? Forever being a student, never being a teacher, even a teacher never fully being only a teacher, right? Always being at least partially a student. There are reminders when they come up for us in a reading that we are forever learning, and that we must resign ourselves to this essential aspect of living, right? This essential aspect of personhood, that we are never finished with the learning process, right? I think it's very important to continually admit this to ourselves, not just about living, not just in the context of our practice, if we are a practitioner of a certain path, but, that even if we feel like we have, come to the point of mastery on something, inevitably there is probably still more to learn, perhaps things that are currently shrouded to us, right? And will only become will only be revealed at the right time. I know all that sounds very woo-woo, but I mean, some things in life are woo-woo, right? Some things in life are like inscrutable in that way. I like that this film is inscrutable at times. I think it makes for a more interesting artistic experience, right? To leave things ambiguous and to find some sense of contentment in that ambiguity, right? It shows, I think, a little less hubris, a little more a sense of humor about oneself, and I think about one's own ability to assign meaning, right? And how that's kind of like a futile thing, right? In the end, to assume that one understands too deeply, right? I think to admit one does not understand will be more illuminating in the long run, and will give you more room for those new experiences and the freedom to change your mind, right? Which is an essential component of living. That ability to admit that you don't know something, that ability to create room for new learning. Touching back on Alice Creek's character, the witch, we, of course, and it goes without saying, you should have watched this film before you listened to this episode, but the witch, towards the end, we realize that it's not the girl in the pink hat, but her mother, and that she she kind of had to make these horrible sacrifices of killing her own family for these kind of powers that she was able to gain. And Perkins describes her character at one point as heartbroken, and in the context of this interview that I keep alluding to, he kind of infers that all the most interesting villains have this element of heartbreak to them, right? He mentions the Wicked Witch of the West and Darth Vader as being these kind of essentially heartbroken villains. And I thought that was a really interesting way to look at villainy. Certainly I found that to be true in my own ruminations on what makes someone evil, right? What causes this kind of like seed of amorality in a person, having no moral compass, no sense of duty to your fellow beings. And I thought of myself a few years back, interestingly enough. Not that I ever really thought of myself as like somebody who would approach like Darth Vader levels of evil, but I know that I went through this period when I was younger, through my 20s, when I was a young adult, where I had a lot of personal difficulties. I had a lot of hardship, I would say, without getting into too much detail. I was struggling a lot in every way, struggling financially, struggling physically, struggling emotionally, mentally, psychologically in the spaces that I was inhabiting. And I went through a period where I, delved in kind of deeper into nihilism, into cynicism. I think we all kind of go through a period like this at some point in our lives, where we kind of dip into the darkness and try to like explore it. Many times I think we're not sure if we actually believe something one way or the other, we kind of only come to an understanding about ourselves and our relationship to a certain kind of belief after we're kind of like exploring it for a while. And I think, I went through a period like that when I was younger, where I was just like a lot more cynical in my approach to things and a lot more cynical towards other people because I had been hurt. So many people go through experiences like that where I felt like, I was trying to open myself up emotionally to other people and was receiving kind of pushback for that, like that other people did not want to engage with me in that way. And I think for a lot of people who have experiences like that, you get to this point where you don't want to engage anymore because you're so tired of being hurt. It's so exhausting to be hurt all the time that you kind of try to close yourself off emotionally so that you just don't feel that level of exhaustion anymore, and that level of emotional agony, so constantly. And I think that's kind of what Perkins is talking about when he describes this character as heartbroken, and that being the jumping off point of her, evil, her philosophical evil. I just thought that was like a beautiful understanding of villainy. And, I think we're going through this period right now in culture where we're seeing these figures ascend to the top pantheon of worldly power, right? Of financial power, government power. And without excusing anything bad that they've done, which is, unspeakable in many cases, I think we all somewhere have an understanding that these are fundamentally heartbroken people, right? That when you are content and happy and joyful and have found a sense of meaning in your life, in your daily life, you have no desire for exorbitant wealth. You have no desire for subjugation of others. And that there has to be this kind of fundamental point of heartbreak before you even begin to aspire to such things, right? Before you even begin to think that those things are for you. You're like, this is my purpose in life, to subjugate others. There has to be some kind of fundamental, break coming before that point. And I think that Perkins describes it aptly as being heartbroken, right? That fundamental human experience of heartbreak that we will all experience at some point. That there are people who take that experience of heartbreak and let it define them, right? And let it fester a vendetta in them to just step on everyone to get to a place where they don't have to feel like that ever again. That being said, the film ends ambiguously still, where there's this kind of like sense of triumph, right, with Gretel and Hansel, where she kind of kills the witch by using her broom and trapping her, so then she catches on fire and saves her brother. Gretel saves her brother after the witch is dead and sends him off by himself to kind of live a normal life, right? But there's this sense that Gretel has gained this power, right, or gained a sense of mastery over her own power to some extent, right, or at least just a sense of like that initial understanding of one's own power, right? But the end is left ambiguous, like as though she could go either way, right? You kind of see her fingers turning black, like Alice Krieg's witch at the very end of the film. And there's this sense of like, she could go, that she has a forked path in front of her, right? Like kind of like that broom that they feature. It's not even a broom. It's like a dowsing rod almost with like two branches. It's a very interesting broom. I really like that kind of like different, the different design, for this witch's broom that they use in the film. And there's just a sense that she could choose to go down, one path or the other. And that it's not like light and darkness per se, but it's more like that sense of self, right? I think that is in question at that point, as it is for all of us in youth, right? I was talking a minute ago about my own experiences when I was young and being a lot more cynical when I was young at a certain point because I had felt so heartbroken consistently by so many experiences that I had had. And that for a while I thought that maybe cynicism was the answer, right? That I thought maybe that would help me not be so heartbroken by everything all the time, was to be colder. Of course, I realized that is not the way, of course, but everybody has to come to their own realization about such things. There's kind of like this sense with people who are in positions of power, who use it to hurt others, right? That they never had this kind of essential meditation within themselves, right? About the need to continually leave oneself open to experience, and not only just experience in general, but like the chance of something benevolent, right? If you close yourself off, you also close off the chance for something benevolent to enter in, right? You're like protecting yourself from things that are hurting you, but at the same time, you're not creating a space for those good things to come in either. And that's kind of what happens when you close that essential door on yourself, right? Of just being like, well, I'm just going to get mine and that's it. Like that callous kind of sense of individualism that I think a lot of Americans particularly suffer from. But you close yourself off to these like essential connections that you could propagate with another person, that you could forge this, essential human connection with other people. You have to accept that there's going to be like inherent difficulty in most things, right? I think that's something that, while I'm thinking of it, that was an essential part of my kind of moving away from cynicism, right? In the end, was coming to this understanding that my pain was not happening in a vacuum, right? That all humans are going to go through these essentially heartbreaking experiences, right? And where we sometimes convince ourselves that we're so alone in these feelings, right, in these experiences, we're in fact sharing a collective experience with thousands of other people on any given day, on any given week. I think that we often, forget that there are all these other people in the world who are inevitably going through very similar, painful, difficult experiences. And that rather than, using them as cause to isolate ourselves, we can use them as a chance to connect with other people who've been through similar experiences and similar heartbreak, find community in those shared experiences. I think once I came to that realization, right, in these things that I had convinced myself that I was so alone in experiencing, that there were hundreds and thousands of other people who had had very similar experiences as I had, similar heartbreaks, right? And that rather than closing myself off from the opportunity to have connections with people, that I could share these experiences with others. And in that way, we would have a mutual understanding that where we had felt so alone, we were in fact in good company with many other people who had been through similar difficulty. I didn't expect this episode to feel like personal therapy today, but here we are. There's also some wonderful dialogue in the film, I feel, that is particularly apt as far as, a connection to the way that practitioners speak to each other, or the way that I think many people feel when they are starting the path in witchcraft. And Alice Krig's character, the witch, is talking to Gretel at one point about her own abilities, her own supernatural abilities of second sight. Gretel is kind of waffling the way she has thus far about like wanting to accept her own powers or kind of deflect them, like kind of ignore them or try to suppress them in some way. Alice Krig's character says, it's already inside you. You can either stay asleep to it or let it wake up. I feel like this, struck me immediately because it was the experience that I felt that I had, and I think many people have when they begin their personal journey with the craft. This feeling that you eventually come to where you realize that this is something that was in you all along, that existed within you, innately that there was this sense that this was something that was always there and that you only recently looked at it, right? It was like kind of like if there's a bunch of closed doors within you, if you think of yourself as like a house that has rooms. I feel like a lot of us in the craft, we get to this point where we feel like we find or are finally looking at these rooms that had their doors closed within us for a long time. And we make this conscious decision to open the door, right? That has always been there. It's just always been shut. And whatever is within it, we just haven't explored, right? Doesn't mean the room's not there. The room has always been there. We just didn't go inside yet. And I think for many of us who began the path to being a practitioner, we realize that we just made a conscious decision to open that door and to look inside that room and see what was there, right? And there's this point in this film where, the witch says to Gretel that this is essentially, this is a room that has always existed inside of you. You can decide if you want to go within it or not, or you can, many people, I think, decide that they're never going to go in that room and they just leave that door shut. That happens, I think, to many people. Ruminating on that on my own time, I feel like I've come to this conclusion that oftentimes people don't want to open those doors within themselves because with that opening, with that new experience that one has to participate in, I think you begin to take ownership over the idea of your own destiny, right? There's much debate over whether destiny is predetermined or if it's something that we have any say or control over. And I think obtusely that the answer is both. And that part of being a practitioner is coming to this like personal ownership of destiny, right? That it is in some ways something that is written, but in other ways it's something that we can decide to look at and alter in often ambiguous ways. I know this is kind of getting into more emotion-based work than it is literal, in that, in many times there's not really great language for what I'm talking about, but I think when we open those doors, dealing with spiritualism and the occult within ourselves, that's such a personal journey, right? That it often can be hard to find words to really explain what goes on in those rooms, within the realms of our own heart and mind, and I think that it can have very crucial differences for each of us, right? But speaking from my own experience, I do feel as though there's kind of a universal acceptance of one's own hand in the inner workings of fate or destiny. And that's really the best way I know how to put it into words. But many people decide that they don't want to have that personal hand in their own destiny, that it's too much pressure, it's too much work, it's easier to just go along with what they've been doing. It's more comfortable, they don't have to do the difficult, painful work of growing. In many ways, I think a lot of people's inability or reticence to do this kind of work, this shadow work, this inner work, as we call it in the craft, has led us to this kind of cultural breaking point that we're at, where a lot of people haven't done the emotional work on themselves to recognize the ways in which they need to participate in their world. It's led to this kind of like sense of immense strain, right? Something so heavy and so out of control, it's about to snap, right? I think we have to occasionally come to these points in culture and kind of reset everything, right? And fix the things that have been broken for a long time, or things that have been like steadily wearing out, right? You're thinking about it like, I don't know, I thought of like all the water lines in this country, right? If you want to think of it in like a literal sense, right? A lot of them are very old. They have needed to be replaced for a long time. There's this like sense of like essential infrastructure failing, right? And I'm not talking about that so much as I'm talking about like a broader sense of emotional and mental fatigue, an emotional and mental structural failing, of people leading into cynicism and moving away from essential human compassion, right? And that times like this, this kind of Aquarian restructuring, to get woo-woo again, is an essential part of the human story. Why? I don't know. We are very stubborn beings, is the best answer I've been able to come up with. Collectively, I'm not talking about individuals as much as I am. The human race collectively is extremely stubborn and adverse to change, right? And maybe this is like, a further sign of our need to evolve past our fear of change, right? Something like that. But, as Gretel does in this film, I think we all come to that essential point of like needing to harness our own destiny, right? Needing to decide if we're going to have any ownership over it or if we're just going to try to let things happen to us without having any hand in them. This is, of course, impossible, but, it's like active hand versus passive hand, right? Like most people would rather just have a passive hand in things. But you have to make a conscious decision to have an active hand in things. And with that comes a lot of heaviness, with that comes a sense of, I think a lot of people are afraid of fucking up, right? They're afraid of doing things, quote unquote, wrong. I don't think there is any way to do things wrong within the course of one's own life, not necessarily as far as like making a decision versus not making a decision and things like that. It's like, I think being like, oh, you made the wrong decision is kind of like maybe not the best way to look at that. I think that oftentimes it's essential that we make mistakes in order to learn, right? We don't learn from success, we learn from failure. So, yeah, this is just kind of like taking ownership of failure, right? At the end of the day, I think the path of the practitioner is similar to other paths of ownership in one's own life. But at the end of the day, I think I came to the conclusion, and it's an essential one that I still believe, is that cynicism is the coward's way out, and or the coward's way through life, perhaps is a better way to say that. And an essential part of bravery, I think, is to take over that sense of ownership in one's own actions and one's own system of belief, and that what we call morality is really more of a sense of ownership over, that essential need for mutual aid in our own experiences and the way we navigate the world around us. But again, the film leaves this ambiguous, and I think that that's the right take, right? That these things are ambiguous to us. The last thing I wanted to mention, I have a little criticism, and then, this little part that this last kind of area that I wanted to talk about. But if I have any criticisms of the film, I would say that there's a lot of expository voiceover in this script. Not my favorite narrative device. Could almost always do without it. Would almost prefer no dialogue to expository voiceover. It's just like, this is the first script that Perkins didn't write himself for his own film. Like I said, I'm not a huge fan of Longlegs, but at least, I'm happy that he wrote that film himself, at least. Not everyone's going to be a winner, but this one, I think you can tell he didn't write this. Doesn't really sound like his voice. There is some voiceover in I Am the Pretty Thing, but I think it's a lot more lyrical or poetic voiceover in that film. It's less literal. This is like a little bit more literal sometimes, or just too kind of talky for my taste. I don't know what it is exactly, but like I said, not my favorite narrative tool. Definitely thought there were plenty of points in this film where no dialogue probably would have been my choice, right? I know studios have a lot of reticence to let things be quiet at all in American films, but and this one was like funded partially, but at least by Warner Brothers, so I think that reflects in kind of like the talkiness of the film. Likewise, I'm not super in love with the soundtrack for this film. It's kind of like electronic-y. I'd much prefer orchestral scores for especially folklore-based films like this. Like the beautiful score for The Green Knight, I think is exceptionally, you know, it's a really, really great score. And yeah, all the orchestral scores for Robert Eggers films, I much, much, much prefer stuff like that if you're telling this kind of folkloric or fairy tale story. I appreciate them, trying to do something different with this or something emotionally new, in the context of a story like this. But I think the visuals are still so kind of like essentially fairy tale, essentially folkloric, that like the score ends up just feeling like a little bit dissonant, like it's kind of like misplaced. That's just my personal opinion. Those are the things about the film that I would probably not have done the way that they are done in the film. Last thing I wanted to mention is this quote by Perkins, and he says, "There's barely any two shots in the film. Everyone's got the frame to themselves. We settled on a formula spent that once it was clear this movie would be self-contained like that, and it allowed us to pull from all styles and tastes and epochs. Brutalist stuff, Soviet design, Jodorowsky stuff, like the filmmaker Alejandro Jodorowsky, magic book stuff. I filled up my shopping cart with everything that interested me." I like this quote a lot. I really love the way the film is framed, personally. I think it has some really, really striking imagery, like all the townsfolk at the beginning. I love those shots. I feel like, I know I keep bringing up Eggers, but I think that they are similar filmmakers in several ways. I think that particularly out of Eggers' films, Nosferatu is framed this way, with this got the frame to themselves, no two shots vibe. Out of all of Eggers' films, I think Nosferatu is the most like that. I know some people, I read some reviews of Nosferatu of people who were critical of the film, mentioning that they disliked that aspect of it. I can see that it would maybe not be for everyone. I think it is very folkloric and very fairy tale, like storybook-esque. I know that for Nosferatu, the painter Caspar David Friedrich was a big influence, and you can see that very clearly in some of the shot compositions in that film. But I think, that feeds into like this very potent, very pointed interest for both these filmmakers in that kind of like folkloric aspect or that mythological aspect of the psyche. And I think it suits both of their works very well. Honestly, Perkins definitely is one of those, like, everybody gets the frame to themselves kind of filmmakers. Personally, I love that about the film. I'm very much into like classic illustration and things like that. So it hits my erogenous zone, or whatever you want to call it. It just hits my sweet spot. I'm like, hit me again with that. Like, I love it. I know some people don't like it. I've heard, a lot of filmmakers allude Eggers specifically to Kubrick. I know Kubrick has been a big influence on him, and Kubrick certainly does that as well. You watch a film like Barry Lyndon where everything is like a painting. I think it is certainly a choice, right? It's certainly a stylistic choice, and I could see why some people would be like, it's just not for me, right? But it's very much so for me. Sandy Settle, it's for me. So love it about this film. Think it's totally beautiful, really striking, really memorable, and works really, really well for folkloric stories in particular. As usual, I'm going to leave y'all with a little spell that has some correlation to the film that I'm talking about. This film is to aid one in finding the way. And I want to emphasize the way here is subjective, right? And that's the kind of the point of the spell, is that it's going to be your way, right? To aid in finding one's own way. This is a really simple spell. Get a piece of paper, draw a circle, pencil or a pen, doesn't matter. You draw it with a quill, I don't care. Draw a circle. Make sure it's like a big circle. Draw another smaller circle inside it. Between the small circle and the edge of the larger circle, draw straight lines like the rays of a sun. So your final product here wants to be a small circle, a larger circle around it, and then rays coming out of the small circle like the rays of a sun that reach the edge of the larger circle. In the spaces between the rays, you want to write forms of craft, for instance, or you want to write other things that speak to you personally if you're not considering being a practitioner, you're not a practitioner already. What you write in the spaces is not super important as far as like what theme they follow, you know? Follow your own intuition as far as what you should write in the spaces, as far as like what finding one's own way would mean to you, right? One's own path, right? If there are things that have been on your mind, you know, I would write those things in those spaces. If there hasn't been something specific on your mind, write things that you're interested in, things that speak to you personally, you know, be it film, be it certain kinds of art, be it certain concentrations, you know, like you're into the sciences, you're really good at maths, like whatever it is. Write those things in those spaces. If you're writing about forms of craft, for instance, I have some examples you could write. You know, you could put hedgecraft in there, like that practice between the worlds. Green witchery, green witchcraft, having to do with, you know, with the natural world. Housecraft, so, you know, like arranging a space in a practitioner's way. Divination. You could write different forms of divination if you feel as though you are a divinator, but you're not sure what concentration that you've settled on at this point. I certainly went through my own path with that specific thing. Strong feelings that I had some kind of divinatory path, some kind of divinatory calling, but for a while couldn't narrow it down. Eventually, I realized that I was a tarot reader. So, you know, if I had done this spell for myself back in the day, for instance, you know, tarot would have inevitably been my answer. But yeah, just examples of things you could write in the spaces. So at this point, you want to use a scrying stone. So you can make your own scrying stone if you don't already have one. You can buy one if you want to. You know, I would highly recommend buying one from a local small business witchcraft store rather than, you know, on Amazon or something, obviously. If you find, you know, a small business on Etsy, buy a scrying stone from them, you know. But you can get some of that really thin wiring and wrap it around a stone and create your own scrying stone that way. Ideally, you want one that you can swing like a pendulum, right? You want a pendulum scrying stone. Those work best for a spell like this. I would say that if you don't have one already, a pendulum scrying stone, or you don't feel like making one, or you can't for some reason, you can also just kind of do like a stone toss, right? That would also work. I would recommend maybe closing your eyes while you're doing it, right? Toss the stone onto the paper and see where it lands. That would also work for this particular spell. But yeah, I would say, you know, using a scrying stone on a pendulum is going to be ideal. The other way is going to be just as valid. At this point, you just want to find your grounding. So if you do yoga or you do meditation, this kind of phrase should be familiar to you, grounding yourself. You just want to give yourself a minute. And this is something that I ask people. If I'm about to read tarot cards for them, I always ask them if they can give themselves a minute to ground themselves. Usually the reason that I give for this is nobody knows, you know, what kind of day you might have had. These days especially, most people are stressed out. So you don't want to be bringing that feeling of stress and that feeling of anxiety and like chaotic energy into the reading, right? Same with this deal with scrying. You don't want to be bringing the chaotic energy into the reading. It's not going to help. And a lot of times it's just going to kind of make things, it's going to make the energy a little bit off. So maybe the answer that you get is not going to feel like it's the right one. It can create a kind of chaotic answer, right? And you kind of, you know, if you're doing a spell like this, ideally you would have a more pointed answer, right? Like an arrow versus like a squiggly line, that kind of thing. You kind of want like an arrow energy manifesting from a spell like this. So you give yourself a minute and just do some deep breathing. As they say in Sesame Street that my kid watches all day, not all day, every day, belly breathing. They're like, belly breathe. So it's just, you know, a deep breath. Same count in and out is usually recommended. So 4 or 5 in, 4 or 5 out. Close your eyes if you need to, you know, just create a space for the answer to come in. And then you want to get your pendulum and you just want to swing it in circles over top. A lot of times you can just let this happen until it kind of comes to a natural stop wherever it's going to stop. And that's your answer. I would highly recommend, trying to be patient when you're doing this. Sometimes it can take a minute for an answer to come out. But eventually you're going to get one. Trust your own intuition and your instinct when it comes to scrying. A lot of people are like, how do I do it the right way? I'm like, trust your own instinct as far as what feels right for you when you're scrying, right? You have to learn to trust your own intuition when it comes to many aspects of the craft, especially in divination, right? You can follow a set of rules if that makes you feel better, right? If it makes you feel like that makes you a better divinator, then do that. But, trusting your own intuition, I think, is essential for any kind of skill that you're learning, right? Essential to any skill, also essential to divination. And on that note, as above, so below, and peace out until next time. This podcast is produced by David Settle. He also made the music.